This isn't just a story I made up to get views. This is my life. What actually happened to me when the world I had carefully built for 15 years was demolished in a single heartless moment. The mahogany table in the conference room of Davies and Finch LLP felt as cold and unyielding as my husband's heart. We were there, under the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, to sign the last pieces of paper that would officially dissolve our marriage. Across from me sat Mark, his jaw set, his expensive suit perfectly tailored to project an aura of calm authority. And next to him, a little too close, was Tiffany, his former secretary, now his everything. She watched me with a look of barely concealed pity that was more insulting than pure hatred. The final document was signed, a paralegal whisked it away, and a heavy silence fell. Mark cleared his throat, reached into his briefcase, and pulled out a small velvet bag. He didn't look at me. He slid it across the polished wood, not to me but to her. "Here," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for Tiffany. "They're yours now. Welcome home." Inside that bag were the keys to my house. The house I designed, the house I bled for, the house where I had loved him. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. Our home was a jewel box perched on the slope of Queen and Hill in Seattle, with a view that swept from the Space Needle to the gray, churning waters of Puget Sound. I wasn't just its occupant, I was its creator. Before I met Mark, I was a budding architect, fresh out of the University of Washington with a portfolio full of dreams. The land was a gift from my grandmother, a small, steep lot everyone said was unbuildable. But I saw its potential. I spent a year of my life designing a house that cascaded down the hillside, a marvel of glass, steel, and warm cedar that seemed to float above the city. Mark came into my life when I was looking for a contractor. He was a developer, charismatic and ambitious, with a smile that could disarm armies. He saw my blueprints and saw a future, for the house and for us. "Clara," he'd said, his hand covering mine over the scattered drawings, "this isn't just a house. It's a masterpiece. Let me help you build it. Let me help you build everything." We fell in love among sawdust and drywall, our dates consisting of checking on plumbing fixtures and arguing about the perfect shade of white for the kitchen cabinets. He convinced me to let his company, Peterson Development, handle the construction. It was more efficient, he'd argued, and he could get the best deals on materials. I poured my premarital savings, every last dime from my early career, into the project. He handled the financing for the construction itself, weaving it into his business accounts in a way my younger, more trusting self never questioned. We got married the day the final inspection was passed, a small ceremony on the deck overlooking the city lights. My career took a back seat. Mark's business was booming, and he needed a partner, a hostess, someone to manage the beautiful life we were building. I convinced myself it was a worthy trade. I had my masterpiece, my home, and the man I loved. What more could I want? The first decade was a blur of cocktail parties, charity galas, and trips to Aspen and Maui. I managed our home with architectural precision, every detail perfect, every event flawlessly executed. I was the silent partner in the brand of Mark Peterson. The first crack appeared not as a tremor, but as a scent. A faint, cloyingly sweet perfume that clung to his suits when he came home late. It wasn't my scent. I wore something subtle, a whisper of sandalwood. This was loud, a scream of gardenias and desperation. When I asked, he'd laugh it off. Must have been someone at the office. You know how they are, Clara. Dousing themselves in it. His office. That's where Tiffany worked. She was young, barely 25, with impossibly white teeth and an ambition that burned a little too brightly in her eyes. She'd started as a temp and, within a year, had become his indispensable executive assistant. She organized his life, his travel, his meetings, and, as I would soon discover, his lies. The late nights became more frequent, attributed to closing a big deal in Bellevue, or a zoning board meeting that ran into the ground. Then came the credit card statements. I still managed our personal accounts, a relic from the early days. I saw a charge from Tiffany and Company. A significant one. My birthday had just passed, and he'd given me a lovely, but much less expensive, bracelet from a local artisan market. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. When I confronted him, holding the paper in a trembling hand, his reaction wasn't guilt. It was annoyance. For God's sake, Clara, it was a closing gift for a client. Are you tracking my every move now? I can't believe this. He made me feel small, paranoid. He was an expert at that, twisting my legitimate concerns into evidence of my own instability. He'd tilt his head, his voice softening with that infuriatingly patient tone. Honey, you're exhausted. You've been planning that fundraiser for months. You're seeing things that aren't there. Trust me. And because I wanted to, because the alternative was unthinkable, I tried. I pushed the doubt down, blaming it on stress, on a marriage that had settled into a comfortable but passionless routine. I told myself that the foundation of our life, the beautiful house on the hill, was strong enough to withstand a few hairline cracks. I was a fool. The final proof was as mundane as it was devastating. I was looking for an insurance document in his home office, a space I rarely entered. Tucked inside a portfolio of blueprints for a new condo project, I found a printout of a flight itinerary. 2 round-trip tickets to Kauai. For a weekend I was scheduled to be in Portland visiting my sister. The names on the tickets were Mark Peterson and Tiffany Wright. The cold knot in my stomach turned to ice, spreading through my veins until I felt frozen from the inside out. I stood there in the quiet, sunlit office of the house I had designed, and I finally understood. The cracks weren't in the foundation. The whole structure was a lie, and it was about to come crashing down on top of me. That night, when he came home humming, smelling of victory and that cheap gardenia perfume, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply looked at him and said, Kauai. I hope you and Tiffany have a wonderful time. The mask of the loving husband didn't just slip, it shattered. His face went blank, then cold with a rage that terrified me. There was no apology, no remorse. Just the chilling, pragmatic finality of a business deal gone wrong. So you know, he said, shrugging off his jacket. I was wondering how long it would take you to figure it out. The ground gave way beneath my feet. He explained it all with the detached air of a quarterly report. The marriage had been stagnant for years. He and Tiffany had a real connection. He was in love. He had already retained an attorney. The papers would be served in the morning. He told me he was being generous, that he would let me stay in the house until we'd sorted out the finances. Don't make this messy, Clara, he warned, his voice low and threatening. You won't win. He slept in the guest room that night. I laid awake in our bed in our room, staring at the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows I had so carefully designed. He thought this was a negotiation. He thought he could just write me a check and discard me like an old set of blueprints. He had no idea that he had just handed a master architect the motivation to design his complete and utter ruin. He was right about one thing. I wouldn't make it messy. I would make it a masterpiece. The next morning, a courier delivered a thick manila envelope. Inside, the divorce petition felt heavier than a tombstone. Mark was gone before I woke up, leaving the house steeped in a silence that was louder than any argument. I sat at my kitchen island, the cool quartz a stark contrast to the burning rage in my chest, and read the legal jargon that proposed to dismantle my life. His lawyer, Arthur Davies, was a piranha in a bespoke suit, known for eviscerating spouses in court. The petition was an act of financial violence. Mark was claiming the house was a marital asset, built with funds from his business, and that its value should be split. His valuation, however, was criminally low. He was offering me a settlement that might, if I was lucky, buy me a shoebox-sized condo in a distant suburb. He was trying to erase me, not just from his life, but from the very city we had called home. He had already frozen our joint accounts, leaving me with only the few $1,000s in my personal checking. It was a classic power play, designed to leave me terrified and desperate, ready to accept any crumbs he threw my way. For the first week, his strategy worked. I was paralyzed by a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. I'd wander through the rooms of my beautiful house, a ghost in my own life, touching the walls, the furniture, the objects we'd collected. Each one was a monument to a shared memory that was now tainted, a lie. I saw Tiffany's smug face everywhere, in the reflection of the polished chrome fixtures, in the empty space beside me in bed. I imagined her laughing with Mark in this very kitchen, her hands on the countertops I had chosen. The humiliation was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. My friends tried to rally, bringing casseroles and wine, offering platitudes that felt hollow. "You're better off without him," they'd say. "He's a monster." They were right, but their words couldn't pay for a lawyer, nor could they restore the 15 years I had invested in a fraudulent partnership. Mark was staying at a luxury suite at the Four Seasons downtown, undoubtedly with Tiffany. He'd occasionally send curt, impersonal texts regarding paperwork or logistics. He was treating our divorce like a corporate merger, and I was the redundant department being eliminated. The turning point didn't come in a flash of righteous anger. It arrived quietly on a Tuesday afternoon thick with Seattle drizzle. I was in the basement, a space I'd designed as my personal archive, sorting through boxes of my old architectural work, trying to decide what was worth keeping. My hands, coated in a fine layer of dust, brushed against a thick, rolled-up set of original vellum drawings. They were the very first plans for the house, the ones I had sketched at my grandmother's kitchen table long before Mark was ever in the picture. Unrolling them, I saw my own handwriting, the precise, elegant script of a younger, more hopeful woman. And there in the title block was the information I had forgotten in the fog of love and shared lives. Project location, parcel 73-4B, King County. Owner, Clara M. Hayes. Hayes. My maiden name. I stared at the words, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. The land. My grandmother hadn't just given me the lot. She had put it in a trust for me, a premarital asset that was mine and mine alone. Mark hadn't bought the land with me. He had built a house on my land. We had commingled funds to build the structure, yes. But the earth beneath it, the very ground the foundation was anchored to, was unequivocally mine. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It felt alien after weeks of tears. Mark, in his arrogance, had seen the house as his triumph, a monument to his success as a developer. He had forgotten the most fundamental rule of real estate. A building is only as secure as the ground it stands on. He had built his new life with his mistress on a foundation that I owned. The grief didn't vanish, but it was joined by something else, something sharp and electric. Purpose. I wasn't a victim to be discarded. I was the landowner. And the rent was about to come due. I went back upstairs, the vellum roll clutched in my hand like a scepter. I looked out the window at the city, at the skyline Mark so desperately wanted to conquer. He saw buildings, assets, numbers on a spreadsheet. I saw structure, foundations, and fatal load-bearing flaws. The war wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. My first call wasn't to a friend or my sister. It was to a name I'd gotten from a contact at my old architectural firm. She wasn't a flashy downtown lawyer like Arthur Davies. Her name was Evelyn Reed, and her small, unassuming office was in Fremont. She specialized in complex property and contract law. She was known not for her courtroom theatrics, but for her terrifyingly meticulous attention to detail. When I met her, she was the opposite of Davies. She was in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of no-nonsense glasses. She didn't offer sympathy, she offered focus. I spread the original drawings and my grandmother's trust documents across her desk. I told her everything. She listened intently, her fingers steepled, her gaze fixed on the papers. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. She slowly tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the title block of the blueprint. "Mr. Peterson," she said, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips, "has made a very, very expensive mistake." She explained the legal position with crystalline clarity. Washington is a community property state, so the value of the house itself, the structure built during the marriage, was indeed a marital asset to be divided. Mark wasn't wrong about that. But the land it sat on was my separate property. It was never commingled. He couldn't force me to sell it, and the house couldn't be sold without the land. They were inextricably linked, a legal Gordian knot of his own making. "He holds you in contempt, Clara," Evelyn said, her voice calm and even. "He believes you're an emotional, hysterical woman he can intimidate into accepting pennies on the dollar. We are going to use that arrogance against him. We will not argue. We will not negotiate his terms. We will simply let him walk into a trap he doesn't even know exists." The strategy was one of quiet compliance. We would respond to Davies's aggressive filings with simple, cooperative language. We would agree to the valuation of the house structure. In fact, we'd even use the inflated appraisal number he provided to make him feel like he was winning. We would let him push and push, believing he was cornering a helpless animal. All the while, we would be gathering our own documentation. The original land deed, the trust paperwork, property tax records showing I had paid them from my separate account before the marriage. We were building a case as carefully as I had once designed a foundation, ensuring every piece was perfectly placed and capable of bearing the immense weight of the victory to come. Over the next 2 months, Mark's smugness grew. He had already moved Tiffany into the house, a brazen act of disrespect meant to grind me down. He'd text me photos of them, smiling on my deck, drinking wine from my cellar. He wanted to provoke a reaction, to make me emotional and reckless. On Evelyn's advice, I never responded. I let him think his psychological warfare was working. His lawyer, Davies, sent increasingly condescending letters, pressing me to accept their more than generous offer before they were forced to litigate the matter to its unfortunate conclusion. We politely deflected, stating we were still reviewing the asset portfolio. They mistook my silence for weakness. They mistook Evelyn's calm for incompetence. They were so busy planning their victory parade they never bothered to check the stability of the ground beneath their feet. The final mediation was scheduled at the same sterile conference room at Davies and Finch. As I walked in, I felt a tremor of the old fear, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, thrilling calm. This wasn't an execution. It was a demolition, and I was holding the detonator. Mark and Tiffany were already seated at the mahogany table, a portrait of smug victory. He wore a crisp blue shirt that brought out his eyes, and she was dressed in a cream-colored silk blouse, looking every bit the lady of the manor. She gave me a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, a gesture of faux magnanimity from a conqueror to the vanquished. Arthur Davies, a portly man with a florid face, shuffled his papers with an air of theatrical impatience. "Well, Clara," he began, forgoing any pleasantries, "I'm glad you've decided to see reason. Mark has a very generous final offer on the table. We sign today, you walk away with a clean break and enough to start over." He slid a settlement document across the table. It was the same insulting lowball offer. Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Take the deal, Clara. It's the best you're going to get. Don't drag this out." This was the moment. The culmination of months of silent, meticulous preparation. I looked at Evelyn, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "Thank you for the offer, Arthur," Evelyn said, her voice smooth as polished granite. "We agree that the valuation of the residential structure at $2.8 million is fair. We are prepared to accept that my client is entitled to half of that value, $1.4 million. Davies and Mark exchanged a triumphant glance. They thought it was over. Tiffany visibly relaxed, a genuine smile finally gracing her lips. "However," Evelyn continued, her voice dropping slightly, acquiring a harder edge, "there seems to be a significant asset you've overlooked in your accounting." Davies frowned. "We've been through the financials with a fine-toothed comb, Ms. Reed. There's nothing else." Evelyn slid a single, thin file folder across the table. It wasn't thick with threats, just clean, undeniable facts. "You've accounted for the house, but you've neglected to account for the land it's built on. King County Parcel 73-4B. Acquired by my client Clara Hayes via an irrevocable family trust in 2008, 2 full years before her marriage to Mr. Peterson. It is, and has always been, her sole and separate property." The silence that followed was stunning. The air in the room seemed to crackle. Davies froze, his hand hovering over his papers. Mark's confident smirk evaporated, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Tiffany looked back and forth between them, her brow furrowed. Davies snatched the folder and opened it. Inside was a certified copy of the original deed and the trust document. He read it, his florid face slowly draining of color. He looked up at Mark, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Is this true?" he hissed under his breath. Mark just stared, his mind clearly racing, rewinding 15 years of blissful arrogance, trying to find the flaw. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time that day, and in my calm, steady gaze he found his answer. He knew he was trapped. "This changes nothing," Davies blustered, trying to regain control. "The land and the house are one property now. It's a marital asset." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Evelyn countered coolly. "The law is quite clear on the distinction between separate and community property. The structure is community. The land is separate. We are not contesting the division of the structure's value. But the land itself is not on the table. It belongs to my client." The implications began to dawn on Mark's face, the stages of his horror unfolding like a slow-motion car crash. He couldn't sell the house, because he didn't own the land. He couldn't force me to sell the land, because it was legally mine. He had poured millions of dollars of marital funds into building an immovable structure on a piece of earth he had absolutely no claim to. Tiffany, finally understanding the magnitude of the disaster, turned pale. The silk blouse suddenly seemed to hang limply on her. The dream home she had so proudly occupied was built on enemy territory. Mark stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. "This is ridiculous. This is a trick," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She planned this. My client planned to build her dream home on land her grandmother left her," Evelyn replied, her voice dangerously quiet. "You were the one who planned to take it from her for a fraction of its worth. An unfortunate miscalculation on your part." Davies was frantically whispering to Mark, but there was nothing to say. The documents were ironclad. Checkmate. I watched them, the two architects of my misery, now trapped in a prison of their own making. They were squatters in my house. The power in the room had shifted so completely it was palpable. It no longer resided in Mark's tailored suit or his lawyer's bluster. It was sitting quietly on my side of the table. "So," I said, speaking for the first time, my voice clear and devoid of any emotion, "here is what is going to happen." Everyone looked at me. Mark's eyes were filled with a venomous hatred that was almost satisfying to see. "We will proceed with the divorce as planned," I continued. "I will receive my half of the value of the house structure. And since you seem to be so comfortable living there, Mark, you and Tiffany can stay. You can have the house." Mark's eyes narrowed, searching for the catch. "What do you want, Clara?" he snarled. "Oh, it's very simple," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You'll be tenants. You will sign a standard, one-year lease agreement. You will pay full market rent for the privilege of living on my land. The first month's rent and a security deposit will be due upon signing the final divorce decree." The look on Tiffany's face was a masterpiece of shattered entitlement. Her dream life, her grand prize, had just turned into a rental. She would be living under the thumb of the woman she had replaced, her name on a lease agreement held by the wife her lover had discarded. "You're insane," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'll tear the damn house down before I pay you a dime." "Feel free," Evelyn chimed in cheerfully. "But since the structure is 50% owned by my client, you'd be destroying her asset along with your own. The demolition costs and the subsequent lawsuit for damages would be substantial. It's far cheaper to just pay the rent." He stared at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had built his entire identity on being the smartest guy in the room, the one who always won. And he had been outmaneuvered, not by a high-powered legal team, but by me, the wife he had dismissed as a decorative, emotional lightweight. The trap hadn't just been sprung. He had eagerly walked into it, blinded by his own hubris. He was trapped. He could fight, and be financially ruined by a protracted legal battle over destroying a marital asset he couldn't move. Or he could swallow his pride, stay in the house he loved, and send me a check every single month. A check that would be a constant, humiliating reminder of his defeat. He knew what he had to do. The smug conqueror had become a cornered animal, and he was about to start paying tribute to the queen he had tried to depose. The final signing was a far cry from the first. There was no smugness, no pitying looks from Tiffany. The air in the conference room was thick with a palpable animosity. Mark signed the divorce decree and the lease agreement with a grim, tight-lipped fury, his pen strokes viciously slashing at the paper. Tiffany, looking drawn and miserable, signed as his co-tenant. Her signature, once a symbol of her victory, was now just the mark of a renter. My first act as their official landlady was to enforce the terms of the lease with chilling precision. The agreement, drafted by the ever-meticulous Evelyn, was a work of art. It included clauses for quarterly inspections, strict rules on alterations to the property, my property, and penalties for late payments. The first rent check arrived via courier on the 1st of the month. It was drawn from Tiffany's personal bank account. Mark was too proud to have his name on it. I held the slip of paper in my hand, a tangible symbol of my victory. It wasn't just money, it was restitution. It was humiliation, quantified and delivered to my mailbox. I used the settlement money and my new rental income to buy a chic, modern condo in South Lake Union, with a stunning view of the water. It was smaller than the Queen and house, but it was all mine. It was a space free of ghosts and lies, a place where I could breathe again. I started taking on small design projects, reconnecting with old colleagues, and slowly rebuilding the career I had abandoned for him. I was rediscovering the woman I was before Mark Peterson, the creative, intelligent, and fiercely independent architect. My quarterly inspections were my favorite part of the arrangement. I would provide the legally required 24-hour notice via a cold, formal email. On the scheduled day, I would let myself in with my own key, a key they couldn't change, and walk through the house with a clipboard making notes. Tiffany was always there, her presence a requirement of the lease for inspections. She would follow me from room to room, her body language screaming with resentment, forced to watch me scrutinize every corner of her new life. I'd run a hand over the kitchen countertops she now used. Seeing a bit of staining here on the quartz. You'll want to be careful with red wine, I'd say with a saccharine smile. It's in the lease addendum, section C, subparagraph 4. Tenant is responsible for damage beyond normal wear and tear. I would walk out onto the deck, my deck, and gaze at the view. The cedar is looking a bit dry. I'll be sending a maintenance crew to restain it next month. They'll need access to the property from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. for 3 days. I trust that won't be an inconvenience. Each visit was a masterclass in psychological torment, all perfectly legal and executed with the polite, detached air of a property manager. I was a constant, smiling specter in their lives, the owner of the very ground beneath their feet. I could see the toll it was taking. The dream life they had stolen was poisoned. How could they enjoy a romantic dinner on the deck, knowing I could show up the next day to inspect the railings? How could she feel like the queen of the castle, knowing she was just a tenant paying rent to the deposed queen? Friends told me I should sell the land, take the money, and sever the connection completely. But they didn't understand. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice. It was about making them live, day in and day out, with the consequences of their betrayal. They couldn't move without breaking the lease and incurring massive financial penalties. They couldn't stay without the constant, galling reminder of my power over them. Mark's business began to suffer. The story of his divorce, and the brilliant way his ex-wife had outmaneuvered him, had become a quiet legend in Seattle's tight-knit real estate and legal circles. The invincible Mark Peterson had been publicly and comprehensively humbled. His aura of untouchable success was shattered, and in his world, perception is everything. The stress gnawed at them. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard whispers of their constant fighting. The grand romance, born in the thrill of deceit, couldn't survive the mundane reality of being tenants in a house haunted by the woman they had wronged. Their perfect life was an illusion, and they were paying a hefty price for the privilege of maintaining it. One evening, about a year after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting on the balcony of my new condo, sipping a glass of wine and watching the boats glide across Lake Union. My phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. Deposit received. It was the rent, right on time, from Tiffany's account. I looked at the city lights, twinkling against the deepening twilight. The Queen and House was up there on the hill, a dark silhouette against the sky. I imagined them inside, moving through the rooms I created, surrounded by the life they stole but could never truly own. He had taken my past, shattered my present, and tried to steal my future. He thought he had left me with nothing, but he was wrong. He left me with everything that mattered. The end.